So please, everyone, at the Daytona Beach Comic Con, welcome Bill Black.
Thank you. I want to introduce Craig Zablo. Craig is going to be the devil's advocate here and ask me questions about what our topic is. I've known Craig since '78 when I relocated to Central Florida. He is best friends with John Beatty, who you may have heard of. Have you heard of John Beatty? Yeah. That's embarrassing. Big time Beatty. He's a star inker for Marvel, among other companies. I've been in the business, we said 45 years on the thing, but it's longer than that. It'll be 50 years later this year, I think. Well, next year will be 50 years. Okay, Craig.
Well, Bill Black, if you don't know, is really a Renaissance guy. He's done it all. He started off in early days of fandom, was a freelance artist, worked for Marvel, worked for Warren, Charlton, and then he decided he wanted to publish his own comics. And he was one of the first. Were you not the
one of the first
independent
publishers,
and
the only one that's still in business
today. And so he decided, he decided to go in that direction. But we want to make this interactive. I'll ask Bill some questions first, and then we'll open it up to you guys because you may have different questions about aspects of his career. But in talking to Bill, you really grew up in the time that seemed to me to be the most ripe because moving in your passions. You guys, one of the things about Bill is he's so passionate about different things, movies, comics. But
that's what this guy was talking about in the last panel.
Absolutely. But your early days of fandom, can you tell us a little bit about days before there was internet, before?
Oh, yeah. I collected comic books since I was 6 years old. And that was in Pennsylvania, then we moved down to Florida in '51. I'm old. And there was not the excitement about comic books here that there was in Pennsylvania, where every household had comic books. So I thought I knew about comics, and I always wanted to draw comics. And I went to school at Florida State, and I sent submissions into Stan Lee and to Archie and Warren Publications, and I got a nice response from Fabulous Flo Steinberg, and I dealt with the people there who actually gave me my first professional job. I was paid $25 to do a sample page for Marvel. This was about 1964, 1965. And luckily they rejected me and they did not hire me. That's lucky because if you're an artist, you have a very small universe. You're sitting at a drawing table 8 or 10 hours a day and you don't interact with the world. Going to Florida State was one of the best experiences I ever had in my life, and I learned how to cope with the world and to be independent. After Florida State, while I was at Florida State, anytime I would do anything for any art class that looked like comic book art, of course, my professors hated that. And I was a big fan of Vincent Price, and I made a point of every art class I was in, when I would submit a drawing I did of Vincent Price, which also was not appreciated. After I graduated in '66, I immediately was drafted and went into the Army in '67. And I did samples. I worked as an illustrator in the Army, and I was allowed to come in after hours. I had a key to the shop. I had a drawing table. All my life I've been blessed with what I call strange luck. And everywhere I go, things get lucky for me. If you've been in the Army or served in the service, you know you don't have access to what I had access to. It was really amazing. So while I was in the Army, I did samples for Warren Publications, and they did, their most famous book was Famous Monsters of Filmland, but they also did comic books, Creepy and Eerie, which were magazine comics, where they were trying to relive the comic books that were censored when the Comics Code came in. Magazine format, you could get away with stuff you weren't under the guidelines of the Comics Code Authority. So long story short, when I got out of the Army, I had already made headway with Bill Parenti, who was the editor at Warren, and he hired me as a freelancer, and I did some work for Creepy and Eerie. So I actually was a professional comic book artist before I was a fan artist. And while I was in the Army, of course, all my life I bought Marvel comics since they started coming out. And in the back of the comics back in those days, they had all these little ads, and people who did fanzines would put their little ads in there. And so I bought a book called the RBCC, the Rockets Blast Comic Collector, which is out of Miami. It was mostly an ad zine, and all the other publishers, these guys should have stayed to listen to this. There were a group of people that I didn't know about that did their own amateur comic books, and they were called fanzines. So I bought maybe half a dozen of these that had good-looking ads. Some of the ads were really horrible, but the ones that were the best looking I bought. And that was my entry in 1969 into comic fandom. And at that time, there were a lot of people who would publish a book, like say Drew, he'd put out WrestleMan or something that he liked, okay? And but most of the comics fanzines dealt with paying homage to Marvel and DC characters. There really weren't any independents at all in those days. So I thought that rather than working for Marvel or DC, where I had to draw Spider-Man or whatever, if you were lucky, it terrified me that I had to draw a New York City cityscape or all those webs. So I thought it was a great idea. If you did your own fanzine, you could publish your own work, you could do your own characters. Much as I loved Captain America and Batman and all that, I felt as an artist I wanted to have my own characters, and that was the direction I took. And I started Paragon Publications, and this is the cover to the 4th issue of Paragon Illustrated. When it was originally published, it was not in full color. It had color, but it wasn't full color. I don't know if you recognize the artwork or if you've even heard of this guy, but at the time, this was one of the hottest guys in the industry. His name is Jim Steranko. Anybody hear of Jim Steranko? No?
We are getting old.
He's hear of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.? Okay, well, he was the main guy. Kirby did the first couple issues, then Steranko took over it. And his artwork set new standards for the industry. And I met Jim at a convention in New York, and we became friends, and he did this piece of art. And J. David Spurlock, who was a publisher, I guess he handles a lot of Steranko stuff, said to me at a convention, he said, have you ever thought about how many people have inked Jim Steranko? And I'd never thought about that before, but there's probably only 6 human beings on the surface of the planet that have inked Jim Steranko, so I got lucky. I inked that, and so I did Paragon Publications, which most fanzine publishers, they did their own title, but I wanted to be like a real comic book company, so I had a series of titles. And between 1970 and 82, I did a line of books for Paragon Publications. This got the attention of Roy Thomas, who was editor at the time, editor-in-chief of Marvel at the time. He started off as a fanboy way before me, and he wrote me a letter saying that then I think it was time I did some inking work for Marvel Comics. So that's how I got into Marvel. I don't know that they had bucket lists back then, but if they did, that would have been one thing I could check off, that I did some work for Marvel, although it wasn't a particularly exciting experience. And it certainly wasn't lucrative experience then. While I was, one of the books I did for Roy was a book called What If the Avengers was formed in the 1950s. Well, I grew up in the 1950s, so I really loved doing that book, and I got to draw characters that I read about back in the 50s. And there were several female characters in the story as support, and I wrote to Roy, I said, wouldn't it be great if Marvel did a book where they made a team of all the female characters? That's never been done before. Don't you think that would be, a good idea? And he wrote me back, said, female characters just don't sell, so he poo-pooed the idea. So I thought it was a good idea, so in my own Paragon Publications, I created the first all-female super team called the Femme Force. We didn't bring one of those.
We did not.
No. Okay, this is some art from some of the, okay, here's a cover. But I think Eric Coyle drew that. So independent comics started in 1981 or 82. A guy named David Scroggie out in California started,
Eclipse?
no, Pacific Comics, which I think historically is the first independent publisher. And he encouraged me to do that, join in and become this was national distribution. Fanzines was all done through the mail, although our circulation on some of my Paragon books, I wish we had today. Selling them by mail, I was able to sell 12,000, 14,000 copies, like one at a time. And I know at one point, Wonder Woman didn't even have a circulation of 10,000.
I think it's important to point out too, because the crowd is so young, that there were no computers to do comics on. So when you were doing a comic back then, the process was much more labor intensive.
Yes. I was working for a film production company at the time, and the corporate company that owned it decided that we would go out of business. So I became a comic book publisher 2 weeks after that. And I was having stuff printed at a local printer, and he knew connections with a big web press printer up in Ocala. And so we did our first AC Comics there. And as Craig was saying, all this stuff is now generated on a computer, and it's real easy. Back then, everything had to be done by hand, and all the color separations had to be done by hand, and it was a very laborious process. I created a lot of characters. I was an artist, a writer, an inker, a letterer, all that. Then we started the comics. I was also a colorist. But after the first month, I realized there's so much labor involved in this, I couldn't do it. So I sought other people to do the actual work. And I just spent like the next 34 years not doing a whole lot of artwork. So before AC Comics, I was doing work like this. And then during AC Comics, I was doing work like this. But only now that I turned AC Comics over to my associate editor in 2014, I'm out from under the 30-day deadline, which is, I was at a point of, after 34 years, reaching a nervous breakdown stage, because you couldn't go anywhere to do anything. You had to do this constantly, because you had to make that deadline every 30 days. If you didn't get your book out, you didn't get paid. If you didn't get paid, you couldn't make your mortgage, you couldn't pay your rent, et cetera, et cetera. So now I'm blissfully retired. I'm still doing everything I did before. I don't have a deadline, which I enjoy, and I'm making a lot more money than I ever did when I was AC Comics. So